what the book does is illuminate how this wisdom and how this knowledge has come about. It highlights the cultural pathway in the journey, like this, the idea of how do you interrogate yourself? Well, it comes from the coming out journey. And so people have to understand and should understand, well, where does that come from? But it also is a very practical guide to say, this is how you can apply this. You can take some of these same lessons. Coming out is a very unique experience for LGBTQ people, but many people have the experience of coming out in the sense of being clear as to who you are really, distinguishing yourself from your parents, your family, your community, from your employer, finding out what's your unique gift to the world and honoring that. That is a very much a sense of coming out.
I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation. And today our guest is Dr. Joel Davis Brown. How are you doing, Joel?
I am great. Happy New Year. How are you today?
I'm good, and Happy New Year to you. I am really interested in our conversation, so thank you for coming on the show. But before we begin, do you have any signature dance moves?
Do I have any signature dance moves? It depends on, no, I don't. It depends on the music. Sometimes do little jazzy things. Sometimes it's hip hop. Sometimes it might be a little bit more soulful rock. So, but for you folks in the UK, if you put on any Craig David, I'm definitely going to get down. So, you know what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I totally get what you're saying about music because I'm quite eclectic as well. For me, it's more like mood stuff, isn't it? If you want to dance, put that on. If you just want to mellow, put some classical on. If you just want to do, it's just whatever your brain needs really at that particular time. So I totally
Exactly.
get it. So, Joe, tell us a bit more about you then.
Oh, good boy. Let's see. Where do I begin with that? Who am I? I'm a person at this point whose focus is on bringing awareness. So I call myself an awareness agent, which is helping people to understand nuance and complexity. So much of what we discuss in the social landscape, I think, is reduced to sound bites and clickbait. And there really can't be any type of nuanced conversations. And so I try to bring and highlight some of that intersectionality, some of that complexity, some of the nuance. I like to bring a historical perspective because I think particularly in this day and age is helpful to remind people that some of the things that we are talking about, we have seen before, we have dealt with before, just in a different context. I am definitely a writer and a poet. That's what's most, that's my foremost passion. But I would say even beyond that, I really take pride in being a responsible global citizen, which means really honoring the pathways and the stories and the struggles of people worldwide. So it doesn't matter what country, it doesn't matter your identity. It's really about the human rights piece. And I remember late last year, I was talking to someone and they were focusing on some type of human rights or some type of social issue. And my response to them is, if you're about a principle, not a population, then you're going to find yourself making or having strange bedfellows. So whether you're talking about what's happening in the Middle East, whether what's happening in parts of Europe or in sub-Saharan Africa or in the States, are you focused on the principle? So for me, the principle is always about equity. It's always about human rights. It's about freedom, which means that I'm an advocate and a supporter of any people who are looking to emancipate and free themselves from the bondages of discrimination and oppression. So that's where I am in terms of a global lens. And then on a more simple level, I'm a husband, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm an uncle, I'm a doggy daddy. So those are the things that give me joy on a daily basis. And those are the things that and those relationships that keep me sane and help me to stay grounded and focused as a spiritual person in this realm. So that's who I am.
Brilliant. I like that. You know what's one of the things that stood out for me there was this whole idea of the global citizen. And I wish more people felt like that, because what I don't get is that you could see oppression in one area and be outraged, and yet the same oppression is just somewhere else in almost exactly the same, just in a different country, and then people aren't outraged. And whilst I can understand this tribalism back in the day, but with the internet and our ability to stay close to people through social media and whatnot, I don't understand why we seem to turn off so easily from people who are different to who we are.
I think it's um, I think it's a distraction. I think
Mm,
a number of the ways in which we create these in-group, out-group dynamics are ways of
mm,
creating distraction. I will confess, a long time ago, I realized that I was very bored with thinking only about the United States and being only in the United States because I knew that the US is not the globe. And thank God it's not. So made a point that I really want to see the world. And in doing so, recognize that traveling and meeting people was really part of my education. So it
mm,
wasn't just about posting pictures and going to these glorious locations and having a good time. It was really about learning more about myself and also connecting to other peoples and learning more about their histories because that's what being a responsible global citizen is. And in doing so, of course, you recognize that there are forces and there are phenomena that are impacting all of us. And some of those, quite frankly, are wielded by people in the United States. And there are things happening in the United States that are very much connected to things happening in the UK and France and
mm,
Hungary and China and Russia and the Philippines and what have you. So then you realize at least I feel like we have a responsibility to be thinking in a more macro level, because I think that's how we come up with solutions. I think
mm,
only when we are being myopic and in some cases ethnocentric that we think these are the issues that only we're facing. And why would I want to take advantage of the expertise in, let's say, Chile or in Kenya or Rwanda or in Sri Lanka to combat issues that we all are dealing with? There is a shared reality. The question is whether we recognize it. And it was really important to me not to get caught up in this arbitrary distinction of, well, I just happen to be born in this region of the world that has these artificial boundaries and constructs. I'll
mm,
never forget going to Spain a long time ago. I was in Barcelona and there was an exhibit in one of the museums where someone had sued the Spanish government to not be a citizen. And their whole argument was creating these artificial categories of citizenship is really a human made scheme and endeavor that really makes no sense. And at first I thought it was odd, but I was fascinated, not just because the person actually sued their national government, they lost their legal battle, but the idea that why are we separating ourselves? And I know because of economics and jobs and
mm,
land use and whatnot, it makes it convenient because you want to protect quote unquote native populations. But the idea that somehow I am going to have so much in common with someone in a country as vast as the United States simply because we exist within an artificially constructed boundary, as opposed to someone who might be in another part of the world who has a different sensibility because they are in a region that has an artificially constructed boundary, just doesn't make sense. And I'm sure it's probably no surprise to you as I've traveled. I find myself talking to people and in many cases having a lot more in common with them than I would have with someone who lives right down the street here, let's say in either San Francisco or New York or other parts of the US. So for me, being a global citizen means to have global awareness. It means to be clear about your advocacy. It means to be mindful, and it means to operate with a level of humility and deference to recognize that there are truths out there that are equally important, if not to the ones that I might experience. And there's learning to be done. So when we think about things such as climate change and migration and
mm,
a lot of the warfare that's taking place, or for example, something like COVID, we do best when we bring all voices to the table so that we can come up with the best solutions. To me, just is common sense. And so that's why global citizenship is so important, not to mention the fact that my communities, my family is global. So the people who I hold closest to me live in all parts of the world. So I can no longer just rely on, talking to people in the US because I have very close friends and people who I, again, would classify as family all around the world. So that for me has helped to broaden my perspective to the point where
yeah.
I definitely am an American in my some of my my energy and some of my sensibilities, but I, in some ways, feel more like a third culture person because I've been influenced and I travel so much and I teach abroad and I studied abroad and work abroad that I feel more global, and that's where I feel more comfortable, and that's where I feel like I do my best work.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I totally get what you're saying about who you have more commonality with. Because I think the days now where we could say a country's made up of exactly the same types of people with the same ideas doesn't really exist anymore because of globalization.
Right.
The fact that we are able through Netflix or Disney or whatever to have an eye on another part of the world. We, it's like in this country, in the UK, like K-pop has gone crazy, for
Hmm.
example. So there's a whole load of people, young people, who are interested in in the Koreans. I watch loads of Korean dramas, for example, because I find them absolutely fascinating and very clever. And all that kind of, I would never, 5 years ago, I would never have thought about Korean drama. But because we're exposed to so much, and if you're open enough, you can, as you say, learn a lot more about you. Um, I'm curious. First of all, actually, I'm curious on the whole LGBTQIA plus definitions, because I think that for a lot of people, it's very confusing. And sometimes even when you think you meet somebody else who gives you a different a different interpretation for the same letter. And you're like, oh, I thought that was for this. No, 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 it's not that, it's this. It's like, oh, okay. So whether there's like different countries call them in slightly different ways. But are you able to help in that form and just let us know what all the letters stand for?
I can to the best of my current understanding, because as you just
Right.
mentioned, right now there's some young person somewhere who's coined another term or has expanded the definition, which I think is good, right? Because if you look at it from the ethnic or racial context, when I was growing up, we were Afro Americans, which makes no sense that we're uh, identified based on our hairdo, but it was, kind of an abbreviation. And then it went to African American, then it
I'm
went to
laughing
Black,
because over here you're Afro-Caribbean, so it made
right?
so carry on.
It was like, yeah, I don't really have an afro. I have more of a fade. But so I love the fact that people are becoming more clear about who they are and they're
Mm,
being expansive. So let me just break down, and I'm probably going to add a couple of letters to what you already shared. So we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, allied, asexual, and then two spirit. And two spirit are those who, I'll go back in reverse order, those who are indigenous and those, in many indigenous nations, not all, but many of them, there was a belief that people who were two spirit possessed both the masculine and feminine energy or
mhm.
had male and female identities. And so rather than trying to say that they belong to one category or the other, they just called them two spirits. So they embodied two different spirits, or there was
Oh, wow.
um, two different forms of essence, if you will. And that's the term that is in indigenous communities and native communities. You have asexual for people who um, perhaps on a spectrum don't necessarily seek physical connection the same way. It's not true that people who are asexual are not sexual. It's just that sex is not as important as it might be to others. You have people who are intersex who for example, may have been born with two sets of genitalia.
Mm,
You have people who are allied, who are very much supportive of the LGBTQ plus community, and may not necessarily identify as LGBTQ plus, but perhaps are questioning or unsure or are agnostic. You have people who are queer, which is kind of the umbrella term. So if you don't want to say all those letters, you say queer because it's easier, which means different than the norm. And I used to reject that term because I thought, well,
mm.
you
It was
know,
a slur at one point, isn't it?
it was. And
Certainly, I think,
also, yeah, and the definition was, you're different from the norm. I'm like, well, I'm not abnormal. I'm quite normal. But then I realized norm was not, we weren't talking about someone's level of sanity. It was talking about norms in terms of what's standard or
Yeah.
accepted within society. And I was like, oh, I get that. So yesterday I was listening to Outkast, a hip hop group, and they talked about what it meant to be an outcast. I was listening to their first album again. And it's the same concept. If you are an
Mm.
outcast in this society, if you um, are oppositional just in your beingness to what people deem to be the standard, the norm, the traditions, then you are quote unquote outcast and therefore also queer. Then you have trans, so people whose idea of or concept of their personal concept of gender is different than how their body may present or what the societal norms and expectations are. And then, of course, you have bisexual, which actually forms the largest cohort within the LGBTQ community,
Mm.
which a lot of people don't realize that there
No,
are
I
more
didn't realize.
bisexual people in the community than the other groups per se. And then you have gay, which is typically associated with men who are attracted to other men, whether it's romantically, physically, sexually, and then lesbian for women who are attracted to members of the same sex. Now, gay at one point was an umbrella term, but
Mm.
in my education, a lot of women said, well, there's a difference between the lesbian community and the gay community, but sometimes people still use gay interchangeably. And then there's all sorts of other terms, such as gender queer, there's non-binary. And I'm learning as everybody else is here. And so I think part of the reason why there's all these terms lumped together, quite frankly, is because I can't speak for all of society, but I think as human beings, we still struggle with sexuality and we still
Mm.
struggle with gender. And gender and sexuality are not just two-dimensional identities; they're really three-dimensional um, identities. And I don't think the constructs and the definitions that we've used historically accurately convey the complexity of sexuality, the complexity of gender, right? So,
Mm.
so what have we done as a larger society? Anything related to gender and sexuality, we're like, okay, let's just put it over here in this category and with this club because you all are different, and we'll just throw it over here into this bin. And I think people are now starting to untangle that and recognize that, well, we really, although there are certainly parallels to our struggles and there are similarities to our journeys, there are some distinct differences. And so I think what you're seeing now, and the reason why you have LGBTQIAA2S plus, is because mainstream society and to some degree our community has put all these things together because it's like, well, let's stand together for the sake of unity and for safety and protection. But we're now starting to see an elevated consciousness where people are saying, well, let's look at some of the nuances and recognize that these things are different, and they're also different around the world. So how they
Mm.
play out, and they have different connotations. So, when I use the term queer, when I'm working in sub-Saharan Africa or Asia or even in Europe, I don't hear that term as much as I do in North America. Um, Although, of course, the term queer, was coined by Michael Foucault, who, was a French philosopher and whatnot. So those are some of the definitions and some of the identities. And I think it's helpful for us to recognize that there's a difference between sexuality and gender identity and gender expression. And that's really at the crux of why all of this is, I would say, fascinating and illuminating and requires more study and exploration.
Brilliant. Thank you for that explanation. I know it will be useful for a lot of people. Thank you for that. And as you said, I think a lot of this stuff is history as well, isn't it? That makes a difference. As I said, before we started in the UK, when I was growing up, queer was definitely a slur, and it took me a long time to say queer, as in the queer community, because I wasn't sure whether that was right until so many people said, no, 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 that's we like that. And it's like, oh, okay, because as far as I was aware, for years you wouldn't say that, so that's quite interesting. Let's listen to a quick advert. As a leader, you know that having a strong level of influence is essential to achieving your goals. But how do you know if you're truly making an impact? Take the How Influential Are You scorecard to get a clear picture of your current level of influence and identify areas for improvement. With personalised recommendations and valuable strategies, you'll be able to amplify your influence and make a real difference as a leader. Don't miss this opportunity to improve your leadership skills. Take the scorecard now at amplifyyourinfluence.scoreapp.com. Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious. Look, you've written a book called The Souls of Queer Folk, and your subtitle is How Understanding LGBTQ plus culture can transform your leadership practice. And I'm really interested in that subtitle. How can it transform leadership practice? Tell us more about that.
Thank you. So the first thing I want people to realize is that leadership, and I say this a lot when I talk, leadership has to be decolonized because leadership, I remember I had a copy of my book and I walked into a gay owned or LGBTQ owned bookstore in San Francisco in the Castro, like right in the heart of the quote unquote queer community, right? And I showed them my book cover. They're like, congratulations, this is great. But they said, but we don't really think we could do anything with a leadership book. And I said, well, what do you think leadership means? And in these conversations, I find that people look at leadership as a business orientation, right? So they're thinking, okay, I go to work, probably at a job that I don't really care for because we know, compared to other parts of the world, particularly in the UK, in Europe, satisfaction with leadership and managers in jobs is lowest across, if you compare all other cohorts across the world. So people are usually thinking, okay, I'm going to a job where I don't feel seen, I don't understand my purpose, I don't feel engaged. That's really the biggest variable there. People don't feel engaged. And I'm supposed to exhibit this thing called leadership from 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. And then I leave and that's it. And leadership usually is around project management or some business deliverable or something related to clients or some corporate vision or strategy. Leadership is not just about business. Leadership is how you live your life. It's how you see yourself when you look in the mirror. It's how you show up with your friends and your family. It's what you do in your community. In addition to also how you might lead with an organization or your employer. So I think that's the first thing. So I think then when we decolonize that and take it out of the corporate capitalistic context, then we recognize that leadership has implications for all of us at every stage of our life, every single day, no matter where you are around the world. Now, the thing that I think also throws people is we're so used to looking at LGBTQ plus people. And I'm just going to say LGBTQ plus. I don't say the entire acronym and get my mouth tired, or just say Rainbow Warriors. The reason why I say the other thing that I think people have to realize is that when we think about the community, and even for people in the community, we think of queer people, the stereotype is we're colorful, we're fun, we're the life of the party. If you want to understand something about how to dress or how to stay up to date on cultural trends, then you definitely want to have a queer friend. You definitely want to have someone queer in your network because they're going to be able to advise you or be your cultural attaché to all things cool. And it's a really limiting belief and it's a limiting framework because what it basically demonstrates is that we still don't understand the true depth, complexity, and beauty of the LGBTQ community. So the world that we live in right now, I think all of us would agree, is a little complex, right? So
yeah, just a tiny bit.
Just a little bit. So the phrase or the term that many social scientists use is called VUCA. And I just want to assure your listeners, this is not a new strain of COVID. So VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So volatile because you have groups fighting over resources, fighting over land. You have uncertainty because there's trends, but we can't always make sense of what those trends mean. Even though, for example, I know in the aftermath of the U.S. election, what amused me was that in the weeks and months after the U.S. presidential election, you had all these experts saying, well, this is definitively what happened. I'm like, how could you possibly know that? As a researcher, you need time. You need to look at multiple factors, and there's rarely just one thing happening. So we have to understand that in the larger world, there are a number of things happening that we can't necessarily always make sense of. There's complexity. So there might be a number of variables that are acting upon a particular system, and they're interacting in such a ways that, or in such a way that we have to understand or account for different things. So, for example, when we think about the wildfires that are taking place in LA, yes, climate change is one. There's also land use is another issue. There's also the fact that there was a very unique meteorological event that took place, which caused the winds to pick up and get to hurricane speeds that caused that fire to spread so rapidly. So when we look at different phenomena, we have to recognize that there's multiple things taking place. And then there's a lot of ambiguity, which means I can't really predict what's going to happen for the future. So what you hear a lot of social scientists say is that this is the world that we live in. We've been living in this for a while, even though we didn't recognize it. And this is the world that we're going to live in for the foreseeable future. So the opportunity for a lot of people, as these social scientists would say, is we have to figure out how do we deal with the VUCA world. Well, as I was doing my research, because initially when I did my research, I just wanted to help reframe how we look at LGBTQ people because I thought it was very simplistic, even among LGBTQ leaders and social scientists. And as I conducted my study and as I started to look at some of the data and some of the information, what really became apparent to me is that LGBTQ people deal with VUCA every single day. And I say this as a member of the community, right? So I don't want to make it sound like this was necessarily a new revelation, but we deal with VUCA. We have always dealt with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, oftentimes because of things beyond our control and because there are people who are hostile to our community. But then I look at the fact that so many of us are not just surviving, but thriving. There's so many of us that have been able to overcome social forces such as religion and government and the law and economics and what have you. And we've been able to not just survive, but thrive. So then I thought, well, if we've been able to, if I was not LGBTQ, but even being LGBTQ, if I'm seeing a group that has basically the world, even though I know today in Europe, for example, in the UK, there's visibility and there are protections for LGBTQ people. The reality is there still is a lot of resistance to LGBTQ freedom. I mean, whether we're talking about trans athletes, whether we're talking about people being open about their sexual orientation and gender identity in the workplace, whether we're talking about teens having access to gender affirming care, there still is a lot of pushback. But what is it that allows this group to survive in their VUCA world? And if this group has been able to not just survive, but thrive, then I think that's something to be said because if I would want to bottle that up. I would want to say, you all have something here that is valuable and important that you've been able to figure out that the rest of us are still struggling with. And what could you teach us that would also help the rest of the world to navigate the same type of dynamic, hence VUCA, and be successful? So that's where the book really came from, it was recognizing that LGBTQ people are not just the life of the party or your colorful neighbors and coworkers. We're also leaders. We also are people who are influencers beyond social media. We are people who can give insight into how to live life at a higher frequency, whether it's around your own authentic expression, it's around your sense of resilience, how we build community, how we look at social justice and advocacy. And that has implications, again, not just at work, but for your entire life. Because we, by very nature of being LGBTQ, we are faced with self-interrogation, understanding who we are, self-actualization, self-awareness, and in that journey, then helping to not only transform ourselves positively, but to transform the world simultaneously as well. So that's what the book is about. And so it's not just about business and it's not just about leadership. It's about a way of living. It's about fulfillment, finding purpose, finding more joy and creativity and living life at the highest level. And so that is a revolutionary concept, not just for people who are non-LGBTQ, but also for LGBTQ people, because I think for many of us, we're still struggling with the idea that, oh, we have value other than X. We can see ourselves not just as, yeah, I know I'm cool. And like I had one person say to me in a at a conference, well, I already know that I already feel good about being LGBTQ and I already know some of this stuff. I said, well, if you know it, then how are you applying it? Are you intentionally using your quote unquote LGBTQ superpowers in a way that is demonstrative and is inspirational for those around you? Are you seeing impact or are you leaving some things by the wayside because you haven't really used your power? Like, are you the superwoman who, has the ability to fly, but you don't use it? And what consequences and implications are for your life that you're not using it or you're discarding it because it's one of those LGBTQ things that you think is just like, yeah, it's not really that important. It's not that cool. So that's where the book came from. And I've been pleased to see people look at the book and say, I never thought about this. And
Yeah.
this is helping me to think differently. And so, and I'm admittedly, it wasn't something that I even anticipated I would be thinking about and writing about when I did my research. But as a researcher, you're supposed to go where the data leads you. And I'm glad that I had the curiosity and the humility to say, I could talk just about what I found from my ethnographic research, but this is a much more fascinating thing that I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
helps us understand that we can be stewards and we are stewards for moving the world forward.
Thank you. And there's something there about how how do we live in the world? I did a little while ago last year, I did sounds so weird saying last year, but last year I did a talk on whose lived in experience is more important. Um because we have a normative lived in experience and then we have everybody else. So the white male, or at least the white middle class male from
Hmm.
certain countries, not all white men, but certain countries, their lived experience is the norm and everybody else's experience is not the norm, whether it's female or whatever. Um, and what you're saying about people from the queer community having a role that other people take from is very similar to lots of other groups, isn't it? And it just made me sort of think it is exploitative in a way, isn't it? It's like, because I've heard it growing up, people say, every girl needs a queer friend. A boy, every like when I was growing up, people would say, every girl needs a gay friend. Um, because exactly what you were saying, that kind of, you know, that person that carry it is similar with black women, isn't it? Like black women should be the ones that fight for everybody. But then it
Yes.
but then it
Yeah.
leaves the people exploited, isn't it? It's like if like what you're saying, if the gay person is the person's life and soul of the party, and the black woman is the fighter, and the white male is this, and then the autistic person is great because they can think through this. It's like we're looking at people through quite a horrible lens, aren't we? We're not looking at through people as through love and collaboration and empathy. We're looking at people from what can we take, what is special about them that we can take and use for ourselves and dispose of them, whatever group we're picking from.
Exactly. And
I've never thought
it's
of it
o-
like that before.
and it's okay to use it to use LGBTQ people to think about romantic relationships or to talk about Black women in terms of having a mentor or to think about life purpose. But then when it comes to voting for a prime minister or a
Mm.
president or the CEO of an organization or deferring or trusting someone in leadership position within the community, do we have that same level of trust? Do we have that same level of care? Do we
Mm.
have that same level of respect? And that is the issue. The other thing I would, share with people too is the LGBTQ wisdom is informed by all these different groups because we're not a homogenous community.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I love
sure.
the fact that more so than probably any other community, um, you have the wisdom of women, of uh, queer people or people who are non-binary and trans. You have the uh, brilliance interjected from every racial and ethnic group, every age group, from every nationality. And so it's an inclusive it's a wide ranging, comprehensive leadership model. It is not just based on a small cadre of people, because I know sometimes people think of the queer community and their profile is like an island off the coast of Sweden. No, this is wisdom that is born out of multiple struggles because we also know that the LGBTQ community has led and supported multiple struggles. Like a lot of people are so surprised to know that Black Lives Matter was founded by three queer women, three Black queer
Mm,
women. People don't realize that.
mm,
Or that women's rights in the States, for example, was influenced heavily by women. So this is just helping to reintroduce us in a way that I think, to your point, takes advantage of our true wisdom and our experience, but does so in a way that's honoring and respectful and not non-exploitative, as you said,
yeah.
because previously it's been seen as it's a very narrow thing, it's a very limiting thing, and it's in some ways it's a very patronizing exercise.
Yeah, and I think a lot of groups have been exploited, not necessarily deliberately,
Right.
but it's, you know, it's a case of, oh, this particular group has a special thing and I'd like to have that, without really thinking what does that mean when you do that. And it's a bit like whenever Disney or some other well-known um entertainment firm tells a story that is not of the norm, people get absolutely people so people lose their minds, you know,
Right.
and it's that it's and I think it's because there's an expectation that there is one norm.
Correct. And I mean, you see it, some of the clearest examples when anything, so there's all this talk now about spirituality and meditation, at least on my side of the Atlantic,
Mm,
getting more in touch with yourself and going internally. Well, a lot of that is native wisdom, right? And a lot of people, particularly in the States, like to invoke native wisdom, although they've never really engaged with native populations. They've never been to a quote unquote a reservation, and they really don't want to give rights to Native American people or
mhm.
even see it in the yoga classes, so, there's this phenomena of the power of yoga. Go get your workout in and get centered and whatnot. But are we really honoring Eastern traditions, Eastern philosophies? Do we really understand where this is coming from? This is not just something that we can corporatize and make money off of. This is something that is born out of people's lived experience, culture, and wisdom, right? So
Mm.
it happens all the time. And I think, one of the hopes with my book is to, again, to elevate, because sometimes people will look at the book, non-LGBTQ people will say, so are you saying that LGBTQ people are better than people who are non-LGBTQ? I said, well, of course not. I said, but we are not worse than either. I said, so all this book is really doing in some levels is a corrective exercise to elevate us to the place where we don't have to argue to be seen. We don't have to go through some extensive exercise to be recognized. Like when you recognize, hopefully after reading this book, that we should be at the table and there should be no question about it. Like our wisdom, our place, who we are is not something that needs to be queried about or questioned anymore. We should be given the same amount of respect as everybody else. So it's really elevating us to a place where we can be more visible as opposed to holding ourselves above anybody else.
So is this a good book for people who aren't from the queer community?
Absolutely. Because core wisdom, I think I say somewhere in the book, and I probably won't say it as artfully as I do there. Um, Queer wisdom isn't just for queer people. The same way, for example, that a lot of the wisdom that we learn from every group out there is not just for that group in particular. I think it's for everybody. So what the book does is illuminate how this wisdom and how this knowledge has come about. It highlights the cultural pathway and the journey, like this, the idea of how do you interrogate yourself? Well, it comes from the coming out journey. And so people have to understand and should understand, well, where does that come from? But it also is a very practical guide to say, this is how you can apply this. You can take some of these same lessons. Coming out is a very unique experience for LGBTQ people, but many people have the experience of coming out in the sense of being clear as to who you are really, distinguish yourself from your parents, your family, your community, from your employer, finding out what's your unique gift to the world and honoring that. That is a
Mm.
very much a sense of coming out. So that's just one of many ways that it can be done, whether it's around authenticity, whether it's around a sense of resiliency, recognizing that community is not just, the people who have the same genotype or the same um, bloodline as you. It can be people who have the same level of consciousness, and there's intentional ways that you can build that. So, for example, in the book, I talk about how during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, by the way, which, we've been through an epidemic and then we were faced
Mm.
with one in 2020. Um, people formed communities um, based out of the ballroom culture. So if anybody has watched any movies like, Paris is Burning or Pose, which was a popular show here in the States, that those shows and those movies were based on the practice back in the late 70s and early 80s, where a number of homeless queer youth in places like New York, Chicago, LA, and places in between didn't have role models. And then you had older um, people within the community who didn't have family, and but they had been through some things to understand how life works and how to survive. And they formed family units. And in these family units, you had an elder or quote unquote a parental figure who supported and counseled and coached younger people on how to
Wow, I
uh,
didn't know that.
survive. And so, not that people need to emulate that, but then it becomes helpful to say you can construct your community any way that you want to. And it doesn't have to be based on, again, the people who you were raised with, the people who that you're related to. And if you take an example like COVID, in the midst of COVID, the people who I saw who were doing best were queer people because we've been through pandemics before, namely HIV
Mm,
and AIDS, right? To understand how do you deal with losing people? How do you deal with not having resources? How do you deal with having very little? How do you find joy? How do you survive? How do you make sense of the world? And I saw a lot of queer subgroups, particularly here in the Bay Area, but also across the country and the world, who said, we've been through this. That knowledge has been passed down. So we know how to deal with questions about
mm,
health, not knowing who to trust, what information is going to be best, how to make sure that you take care of yourself mentally and emotionally, and how to make sure that you don't become fatalistic in your approach to life. So there's all sorts of wisdom that can be transferred if people can get beyond their own biases and their own stereotypes and their own internal voices saying, well, I can't learn anything because of X, Y, and Z. And I think that's where the future of leadership has to be, where we can learn from
mm.
everybody. Because my personal mantra is no matter who I'm talking to, I can learn something. Now, the question is it a negative lesson or is it a positive lesson? Sometimes you learn what not to do. And sometimes you learn, okay, this is what I should do. But in every interaction, there is a lesson, there's opportunity to be better, to grow. And so,
Yeah.
really, what I ask people is just to employ a growth mindset and to recognize that you can grow and you can learn. Whatever is applicable to you, take it in. And if it isn't applicable to you, then leave it out. But don't forego this wisdom because, again, the problems that we're dealing with are much too great for us to ignore anybody's contribution, especially that of what I believe is the emerging population of our time, which is the LGBTQ community, which exists in every part of the globe.
Thank you for that. I think that's a point. That's one of the things in terms of essence of leadership is to get the best out of everybody. And we already know that diverse teams, all sorts of diversity of thought, cognitive diversity, makes teams stronger because you see things from much different perspectives. It's the whole thing about survival and thriving, isn't it? If everybody thought the same way, as an organism, you're more likely to die, aren't you? Everyone's doing the same thing. But if you've got those mavericks, those outcasts, those people from different lived experiences that go, yeah, I wouldn't see it like that. I'd see it like this. Then it opens that up. Is that one of the reasons why you've got a chapter in your book called How the LGBTQ plus culture is a study in transformational leadership? Is it because, as you said, that the queer community has to gone through massive changes over the years and massive, I mean, there's still parts of the world where to be from that community is a death sentence, isn't there?
Absolutely. Um, and frankly, in certain parts of the US, uh,
Really?
it, not so much in terms of, let's look at death in a different way. Death in terms of not being affirmed, seen, or validated. Being
Okay.
told that if you seek care, if you offer support, that you could be jailed or imprisoned. To have your culture erased. That's very much a reality in, half of the United States right now. So, for example, in
Mm,
Florida, teachers can't teach or use anything referencing the LGBTQ community. So what does that say to a young person who's trying to develop their self-esteem? If you don't see yourself then you can't be yourself. And not being yourself is a form of death. It is a form of violence. It is a form of suppression and oppression because it means that you continue to suffer. You continue to ignore your own light instead of recognizing that you do matter and that your humanity should be recognized. So that's what I mean by that. I
That's
think in terms,
you know what? Sorry, that's just kind of thrown me actually, because it's like saying that queer people bring absolutely nothing to anybody. That's what that's saying, isn't it?
oh, absolutely.
Because
And not only
it's like it doesn't. And then and then we haven't learned anything from like Alan Turing,
correct.
with the Enigma. I mean, he ended up killing himself, and
Mhm.
look what he brought into the world, and yet over something
Exactly.
so silly, just
Right. It not only erases us, but also sends the message that who we are is sinister, substandard, subhuman. I can't even mention the fact I can't even say gay. I can't even say lesbian. I can't say bi. I can't read a book. I can't introduce a lesson. And we know that, as you just referenced, that the contributions of LGBTQ people are plentiful throughout
yeah,
history. So it's a very dangerous thing. And so when I think about transformational leadership, I think that the reason why I wrote that chapter is because there's a lot of different forms of leadership, but I'm speaking about a very particular kind. So there's leadership that, um, if you look at leadership in a very basic way, it's basically getting other people to, is the ability to influence people to achieve a certain outcome. That's what leadership is. Now, some people use leadership to achieve very bad things. And
mm,
so, in my definition of leadership and transformational leadership, what I say is, yes, there are people who are leading others to do very bad things. I think I'm only interested in transformational leadership, which positively transforms both the individual and the environment. There's a symbiotic relationship. And in that sense, that's where I think LGBTQ people have cachet because we have done work to positively transform the environment. Interestingly enough, in the 90s, Richard Florida wrote this book called The Cultural Creatives, and he talked about how LGBTQ people were transforming communities and bringing in, you know, shops and revitalizing neighborhoods. So he talked
mm,
about, South Beach, because a lot of people don't recognize that South Beach used to be a dump until the queer community went in there in the mid 80s and transformed it. And all of a sudden it's the international destination and queer people can't even really go there anymore and feel safe because you get people going there and they want to there's a lot of bravado and a lot of different energy, right? I'm not saying that we can go there because we still are there, but it's a different energy, a different space.
yeah,
So, of course, Richard Florida talked about it from a capitalistic standpoint, right?
mm,
What if we shifted that and also, or not just shifted, but also looked and recognized that you can also learn from the queer community from a spiritual perspective, from a humanistic perspective, from an emotional perspective, from a mental perspective, and yes, from a global perspective. So that's where it comes down for me is recognizing that leadership, there's so many different forms of leadership, but the leadership that I think I want to see, and I think the leadership that will help move this planet forward is a type that has positive intentions, positive design, and positive ends. And that type of leadership is a type of leadership that I think most of us want to need. And that is a type of leadership that LGBTQ people have been able to curate.
um, and I think what you're saying, transformational leadership is really important, but it requires, I say, cognitive diversity and openness to actually make a difference. And I think that whenever we reach a point where we say we don't like a thing, so it will not exist, so we'll educate that out so that nobody would know. Sounds so much like 1984 and
Right.
Orwell. That once you do it for a community, you do it for all communities because it never, whatever you, that kind of stuff never stops, does it? It's not once once you've brought in the idea that this is possible, it will then continue to another community or another thing, and then you just, well, you just don't get positive outcomes eventually.
Correct. And I think the other thing with transformational leadership that's really important is to recognize that you have to transform yourself.
Yes.
I've been a coach now an executive coach for 20 years, and I still see leaders who are very externally focused. So they'll say, with good intention, I want to impact this group. I want to lead this company. I want to, bring about this change. And that's great. And I say, well, to do that, you have to be the very thing that you want to see in the world. So how are you bringing that forward? How are you changing yourself? Have you examined who you are, and do you understand who you are and why you do what you do? And for a number of us, that's a very scary thing to think about. Like, oh, you want me to sit and look at myself and examine myself and question myself? Yes. Because guess
Mm,
what? If you do not, if you haven't taken the time to do that, guess who's going to pay the price? Other people, because
mm,
you will be engaged in unexamined, uncritical behavior um, that unknowingly sometimes and sometimes very clearly has negative consequences for other people. So that's why it is vitally important to begin internally first. And we know that on the road to LGBTQ emancipation and freedom, every LGBTQ person has had to do that. Everyone has had to say to themselves, I am, I feel, I see, I behave, I look, I walk differently. What does that mean for me? First, there's a recognition. Then there's a distinguishing of oneself from what is the norm. Then there has to be um, further exploration, and then there's an embrace, and then there's the um, advancement or the moving forward in this is who I am. That process is not something that I think we can overlook. And I think by doing so and continuing to do so, because it's not something that you just do, because of course we're all growing and evolving. The person who I am today is different than the person who I was 2 years ago. I have to constantly say to myself, how and who am I? What am I doing? How am I showing up? And how can I be better? That's how I can positively impact, again, myself, my family, my community, the country, the corporation, the organization, the nonprofit, and the world. That's how we do that. And so I'm not interested in transactional leadership, which is the let me just kind of microwave something and give you kind of a sharp or slick marketing plan, and I give you all this pizzazz and whatnot, and pomp and circumstance. Because we see those leaders melt down, we see those organizations, we see those communities suffer as a consequence. I'm talking about something that has sustainability, something that will maintain itself for the long run, and you can only do that when you've actually done the internal work, which then leads to greater external impact. That's why this is so important. And that's what I mean by transformational leadership. And that's how LGBTQ people, I think, are good role models for this brand of leadership.
brilliant. I love that. Joel, this has been a very thoughtful conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And I always love spending time with my friends over in the UK. I was just talking to some people this morning from the UK. And so I look forward to getting over there, as you and I mentioned, when it's warmer. And
Might be
definitely,
why.
exactly, meeting you in person, but to all my friends and new friends and um, what I would say fam in the UK, it's been a pleasure. And I hope that you'll be able to pick up the book, you'll engage, and, certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm trying to lower my social media imprint or to be more selective about where I am. But you can find me if you look for me. So please reach out, engage, say hello. We don't get anywhere in this world without community and without supporting each other. So thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome, and thank you. And thank you out there for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I'm Judith Germain, your host, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.
The Maverick Paradox Magazine. The Maverick Paradox Magazine is for the pathologically curious. Written by a swagger of socialized mavericks who are divergent thinkers, the magazine tackles the biggest issues affecting maverick leaders today. You might be a business owner or a leader within an organization who wants to have your thinking challenged, to be exposed to a diversity of thought, or to learn from diverse experts in their fields. If so, the Maverick Paradox Magazine is for you. Join the swagger at themaverickparadox.com and engage in the conversation.